Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our discussion of the legal aspects of BDS. We have fantastic speakers and a great panel, so let's get right to it. First off, it's an honor and a privilege to introduce the Deputy President of the Supreme Court of Israel, the Honorable Elyakim Rubinstein.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had your lunch and you're now ready to take a nap. So I'm going to supply the nap. So, and you also have a jacket, so I'll take it off because it becomes warm, kind of. I see some people here. Many years ago, Joe Sisko, who was the Undersecretary of State under Kissinger, used to tell this story about a guy who was the only survivor of a flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania back in 1889, and thereafter made his living on lecturing on how I survived that flood. And for 60 years he did that. And finally, what will happen to most of us, at least, he was called to the Almighty. And the angel in charge says to him, look, we have the Club of the Newcomers here every Tuesday afternoon. Why won't you introduce yourself? He says, fine. He says, what be your topic? He says, I speak about how I survived the Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood back in 1889. And the angel says, look, it's such a narrow topic. Why won't you pick up something more universal? And the person says, well, that's all I know. I made my living on that. As he said, and the angel says, okay, if you want to do that, go ahead. But you should know that Noah is going to be in the audience. And so there are quite a number of people here who qualify for the Noah kind of description, so I apologize to you. That was the secret part so far, so now you'll... And I'd like to dedicate this part of my remarks to the late Shlomo Argov, who was our ambassador to London, and before that a very successful and highly appreciated Israeli diplomat for many years, who was shot by terrorists in June of '82 in London while being the ambassador there, and for the next 21 years was paralyzed and was in the hospital in Jerusalem until he passed away in 2003. He was a victim of terrorism, and he was a great representative of Israel. He also served here in New York. And my other dedication is to the late David Ben Raphael Goldman, who was the son of the mythological executive director of the joint of the JDC, Ralph Goldman, alav shalom, and who was killed in our embassy in Buenos Aires in '92 when the embassy exploded by Iranian terrorists. So these two people personify. And then David was a lawyer in the service. He was my assistant when I was legal advisor of the Foreign Ministry and represented us here in the 6th Committee of the UN. So these two people are Israeli representatives who personify the pain that terrorism causes, and that the propaganda which fuels terrorism, it could be here and there, it could be BDS, it could be something else, is a plague which has to be faced, and has to be faced not only by Jews, but by Christians, by Muslims who are interested, by anybody who's fair and honest. In the morning plenary, I briefly described the functioning of the Israeli Supreme Court as a high court of justice, that is, taking petitions as a court of original jurisdiction from the public against the government or any of its agencies. I would like to slightly expand on that. This is as part of the effort to show you or to show people what Israel in this respect, in the area I come from, the law is really like. I do not purport to be an expert on American and European law. I will only briefly refer to that, but I will discuss a case of, which I also mentioned, of constitutional law decided in 2015 in Israel pertaining to boycott. One of the characteristics of our Supreme Court as a High Court of Justice is that it decided quite a number of years ago, I think about 30 years ago, much before I entered the court, which was 12 years ago, to give up or to do away with the requirement of standing or locus standi, as long as it refers to petitions against the government submitted to the court, as I mentioned before, originally. When I was in law school, they taught us that in order to submit a petition to the High Court of Justice against the government, you have to show your own part, your own interest in the case. You lost a bid, you were not appointed to a position, your rights were, personal rights were discriminated against, whatever. No more. About 30 years ago, the court decided that anybody who wants to petition, and it could be private people, citizens or non-citizens, Palestinians, it could be voluntary associations, it could be Knesset members, and of course there's always a danger that there will be people who would qualify for the Nudnik PhD, that is, trying to get a headline or something like that, but we accept that because we believe there's an importance in the ability of anybody to petition the court. And in our specific context, our context today, this is connected with Palestinian or groups working for the Palestinians' rights. Give you one example, there are many. In between 2000 and 2003, Israel was under heavy terror attacks, including suicide bombers that exploded in buses, in restaurants, in coffee shops, in wedding halls, bus stations, and the like. It was a horrible period. Our people lost their families. I don't think there's anybody in Israel who didn't meet somebody who lost their family, in a member of the family in these attacks. And including my own friends and close friends. And Israelis were maimed and killed, and perpetrators were Palestinians. What do you do about it? By the way, at the time, hotel rooms in Israel were empty. I remember visiting a friend from Chicago who came to one of the biggest hotels in Jerusalem, and I asked the receptionist, how many rooms do you have occupied? She said 12 out of hundreds. So I remember that year I used to go, I don't like restaurants, to be honest. Don't take it personally. Some of you may like them. But it just, for me, a waste of time. In any case, that year I used to go with my wife and schlep also friends to restaurants once a week just to show presence and to give them some means of living. So what did we have to do? on this, came up the idea of the security fence. Security fence that is being erected to curb the abilities of Palestinian terrorists to move from the West Bank or Judea and Samaria to the Israeli side of the fence. We were so much into it, I was the Attorney General at the time, that I used to call the Minister of Defense Minister of the Fence, because that was all we were doing. Okay, good idea, but Palestinian villagers from the areas adjacent to the fence complained, petitioned to the court. Why? The defense caused them difficulties in terms of access to their fields, because if they had to drive 10 minutes to the field, now they'll have to ride half an hour, 40 minutes because of the fence. What did the court do? While and of course there were petitions that said the court is illegal internationally and so on, and our good friends went to the Hague Court, which came up with some resolution. But our court went in two ways. On one hand side, it decided the legality of the fence because the government has to defend its people. It's one of its foremost obligations to defend people from getting killed by terrorists. On the other hand, it said you ought to take into consideration the inconveniences to Palestinians, and so the court went sector by sector. Some of the cases I dealt already when I became a justice some years later, sector by sector, and in some sectors the court rerouted the fence so as to, on one hand side, let the fence be erected, but on the other hand, even with a little bit less security, ease the life of those Palestinian villagers as concerning their access. So this is just one example. The court is serving as a balancing factor between urgent needs of national security, which is a vital part of our existence, as you all know, in this volatile and terror-ridden part of the world, and between the needs of human rights, civil rights. You know, our former president, Aaron Barak, whose name is well known internationally, big jurist, he is a Holocaust survivor. His parents saved him from extermination in Kovno in Lithuania at the age of 5 and 6. They were dragging him in a sack from one place to the other in a big bag, and the family survived, helped by non-Jews in that area. He always says, and I adopted his words, he says, the Holocaust has two lessons for him. One is the need for a Jewish state, because gates should be open day and night to Jews who are being persecuted, unlike the Holocaust days where the St. Louis sheep, for instance, roamed around the shores of this great country and finally went back to Europe and the people were done with. So this is one lesson, the need of a Jewish state. But the other lesson is human rights, because they treated us like scam, the Nazis and their helpers. We should be guardians of human rights. And I remember this advice of Professor Barak, because it gives you the context in which we are trying to work. And we deal with Palestinian issues. Why do I mention all of that? This is not BDS. This is to inform you, so to speak, those who are not into every part of our legal work and of our daily existence as a court, that this thing exists and it's working. Again, I said before in the plenary, nobody is perfect. nor is the court perfect, nor is anybody in anywhere perfect, but there are many humanitarian issues that come up and are dealt with by us, and I'm only speaking now not on gender issues, on government land, and these are all internal Israeli questions. I'm speaking only of the Palestinian issues. So questions of problems between settlements and Palestinians, we would never okay taking of private land for settlement, only government land. I remember during the Cast-led operation some years ago that we had a number of petitions within the days of the war from Palestinians. This is unusual. You won't find courts in the world that would take within a war a case and deal with it in an administrative case. So there were cases like, and this, by the way, was after Israel voluntarily evacuated Gaza Strip in toto, all of Gaza Strip. No soldier, no Israelis, no settlement, nothing. No synagogues, whatever, everything. And here we have these rockets coming up, and we had this operation. And there were a number of petitions within that operation, within the war. And I happened to sit as a justice on all of them. And they included, some of them included the electricity supply, water supply to the population there. Some even included the access to journalists, whatever. We finished all of them within a day or two promptly, and the problems were solved. Again, I'm not telling this just to show how good we are, but to show what the reality is and how the legal part of the country is trying to contribute. And sometimes we have administrative detentions, as this country has. By the way, in the United States, I'm not criticizing, God forbid, this good country, but the Guantanamo case came to the Supreme Court maybe 2+ years after this was opened, this prison. We deal with these issues like detentions on a very kind of trying to deal with it swiftly. For instance, if there's an administrative detention, sometimes also of Jews who are connected with terror, and why are there administrative detentions? Because the detention is based on intelligence, and you can't submit an indictment, a regular trial with intelligence. What would you show? You bring your agent, or you'll bring you want to kill the agent, or you want to expose all your security methods. So there are some detentions. 3 justices of the Supreme Court, after 2 military courts have reviewed the case, would review each week detentions and see. Sometimes we would tell the government, shorten it. Sometimes we would tell them this or that. There's a dialogue. We hear part of it in camera, but it's dealt with by Supreme Court justices all along, all the time. And so now I'm moving to another point. In 2011, the Knesset passed the law of prevention harm to the state of Israel through boycott. I'll call it the boycott law, which imposes sanctions on those who call for a boycott against Israel. The law has basically 2 tracks. The first makes it a tort to, I'm quoting, knowingly publish a public call for a boycott against the state of Israel. The second is administrative, allowing the Minister of Finance to issue regulations restricting those who call for a boycott from participating in state tenders or deny them some state benefits. That is, you'd call it those who are biting the hand that feeds. This law was challenged. Now, Israel doesn't have, as many of you know, a full-fledged constitution. You can't go into a courtroom and buy a courtroom. I come from the courtroom, so you can't go to a bookstore and buy the Israeli constitution. But you can buy basic laws, 11 of them, which our court 21 years ago decided to view them as a functional constitution, so you can challenge them within a judicial review, the way they are challenged in this country, the laws against the Constitution. In fact, my good wife argued the case in the Supreme Court, so I must remember this case of 1995, otherwise I can't get back home. So, so this law, the boycott law, was challenged. And a panel of 9 justices dealt with the case, myself included, my colleague who was here before, Justice Amit too. And by a majority decision of 5-4, the court decided to basically uphold the law, with the exception of striking down one section which allowed punitive damages independent of actual damage caused on those who deliberately and maliciously call for boycott. This was, we struck down this unanimously. But the basic tenets of the law were upheld by 5-4, which had different, their reasoning was different, but 5-4. What by the way, there's an affinity of boycott in the law. I'm reading it. It's not that long, but it's not that short also. You know, when many of you are lawyers, when you want to define something, you know, Justice Brandeis once, Justice Stuart once said that he doesn't know how to define pornography, but when he sees it, he knows that it is. That's, I think, one of his main contributions, and or at least a very well remembered contribution. I should respect him. He was a respectful justice of your court. And here's the definition of, by the way, another justice, Brandeis, whom I mentioned by mistake. In fact, maybe it was a Freudian mistake, because he said something which we try to cherish, that the best disinfection is the sunlight. That is, government should be transparent. And that's so important. Now, here's the definition. Deliberately avoiding economic, cultural, or academic ties with another person or body solely because of their affinity with the state of Israel, what is this word? Whatever, with the state of Israel, one of its institutions, or an area under its control. The words area under its control were part of the debate, because it refers, of course, to the territories which are in the West Bank. And or under its control in such a way that may cause economic, cultural, or academic damage. That was the definition. Now, the majority of the court ruled, and Justice Amit, myself, we were part of the majority, ruled that while the law does infringe on the right, of course, it basically ran around was around the question of freedom of expression, which in this country is sanctified by the First Amendment, but it's not the same neither in Israel nor in Europe, although I should say there are quite a number of justices on our court which have great, now I'll use the term affinity properly, great affinity to the American approach. personally, I'm not there exactly. While the majority, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you also why, because I come also from the point of view of Jewish law as an inspiration, Jewish historic law. And the question of defamation and libel and slander is deeply entrenched into Jewish law, and there was a major sage of the former century, the Chafetz Chaim, who dedicated his life to that. And I always say that the human dignity, which is our basic law, it's called human dignity and freedom. What is the most important part of your dignity, if not your good name? Many people would give all they have for the good name. So while the majority did think that the law infringes on the right of the freedom of expression, it does not undermine, I'm quoting, the core component of freedom of speech. And except for those punitive damages, while we do not judge the wisdom of the legislation, some of us would say we can live without that legislation, okay. And as your Chief Justice Roberts said in the Obamacare case, we don't judge the wisdom of the legislation, but this legislation could be and could also not be, but it's there, and there's a reason to it. And we said that the notion that came up in this particular case, the notion of defending the state in terms of those who want to harm not only the state but its businesses, its people. And in the courtroom, interestingly enough, we asked the petitioners, suppose we omit the language on the territories. Suppose we leave it just boycott on the state of Israel. Would you take back the petition? The answer was no. And that's a fact. That was, so the time is running, so I'll just say that this was the majority, and as far as the minority opinion and the separate dissenting opinions spoke really about the violation of the freedom of speech, and that a call for political boycott can serve as a peaceful instrument to achieving political aims, in particular connected with settlements, for this need to preserve free speech and so on. Of course, I respect that position. I tell you what it was, and it shows the lively debate that goes on in Israel and within the court. But I'm underlining that the bottom line was that it wasn't only the territories, the settlements, because we asked specifically. And in my own concurring decision, I mentioned that position that they use, and I mentioned also that even a boycott, there was a boycott I mentioned before on Israel for many years, the Arab boycott. And the Arab boycott was fought against even by the United States. Your country passed laws in Congress connected with that. So there is a possibility when there is a call for action like the Arab boycott at the time on any business with Israel. And and I said also, and I'll finish this part, and I'm close to finishing, I said, you know whose freedom of expression was limited by this law? Another group's freedom of expression. Those whose means of living and whose property is being challenged and who are going to lose them because of that. So where's common sense? Where is common sense here? So that was my opinion. This subject is when I was preparing for this event, and even much before, I began to read decisions by European courts, by American courts, legislative efforts, articles, and what have you on these issues. And there is much debate going on, legally or otherwise. You cannot say that the fight against BDS is something which is that difficult that you cannot win the war. The answer is you can win the war. How do I know? Thank you very much. This is to enable you to make a bracha. In this country, the debate always evolves around the freedom of expression, the First Amendment. In other countries, if legislative measures by some states are constitutional or unconstitutional, this is what comes up all the time. You read, there are people who are much, much more knowledgeable on that, so I will not mention cases, Claiborne and others that said this or said that. But at the end of the day, you can see that this is not black and white. This is not something clear that cannot be. And in other countries, take France, for example, and their legislation and their court decisions against the BDS were okayed in the European Court of Human Rights. Other countries debate and initiate legislation. In England it comes up. In France, you know what happened from anti-Semitism point of view, so it's not very surprising that they are coming up all the time with initiatives. So the Netherlands last week, I was disappointed to read that the foreign minister said, well, freedom of expression and so on and so forth. My conclusion is simple and should not at all surprise you. It shows that there is much room and work to do, and unlike the pessimistic approach, it is far from being futile. I do know that some people argue that this fight is overdue. Some people, on the other hand, think that this fight is overdone. I don't think it's overdone. It is not, because if somebody is chasing you, persecuting you, you shouldn't be sitting still. You'll be stupid sitting still. And the legal possibilities are there. There is no question that the legal fight here is difficult, but as my colleague Justice Meltzer shows in our boycott case, even in the U.S. First Amendment cases, the picture is not one-sided. Definitely it is the case in Europe. It is then good that this event takes place and you are now going to discuss in more detailed and in more learned way the possibilities. And the fight is not for the Jews only. I remember years ago when I suggested to our government, I'm speaking now as a piece of archaeology, this is 1987. I was a cabinet secretary, and I suggested to Prime Minister Shamir that we should monitor anti-Semitism. He said, okay. I went to one of the most senior politicians and ministers of Israel, and I said to him, give me a representative for the forum I am establishing. He said, Eli, I'm quoting, governments have to deal with the present and the future. Anti-Semitism is a matter of the past. What are you talking about? Well, he was wrong, unfortunately. So I remember Per Elmark, a Swedish deputy prime minister and a friend of Jews, told me, make sure when you fight anti-Semitism, and that was before BDS, that non-Jews join you, that it's not a Jewish matter. And I think this is valid today too, and we should remember that. There are three, and this is really my final, there are three ways to fight BDS, to fight anti-Semitism. One is political, public diplomacy, telling them what they are, calling their bluff. The other is educational, to make people know what they are talking about when I talk Israel, when I talk Jews, when I talk the Jewish state. And the third is legal. And this panel, legal because there's room to go to courts, to show the facts, to use legal means. We heard from Mr. Sokolov before. I think these things should continue, and I wish whoever is going to do the work much luck with God's help. Toda Rabba. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Justice Rubinstein for once again sharing your invaluable legal perspective and insight. Thank you very much, Justice Rubinstein. I want to, before we continue, the schedule's a bit tight, so unfortunately we could go on for hours, but we have a tight schedule, and after this we have another session, so we'll try to be brief with the speakers. And I want to introduce our next speaker, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you, Justice Rubinstein, Ambassador Danone, and World Jewish Congress President Ron Lauder. You know, it's ironic to be speaking here today at the United Nations. When you think about it, the UN is the place that helped to legitimize Israel as a member of the international community in 1948, creating a formal nation state that represented another step in our 4,000-year history, the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And yet we know the UN has helped to delegitimize Israel in recent years, as its organs like the UN Human Rights Council, or UNESCO, or even the WHO recently, have been captured by anti-Israel elements who subvert the work of these entities in service to their rabid, irrational anti-Israel agenda. So there's a very meaningful irony to this conference being here today. But I start with the proposition, building a bit on what the Justice said, that we need a multi-layered strategy to deal with the ongoing campaign of delegitimization of Israel. And let's make no mistake, that's what it is, a campaign of delegitimization, including the tactic of BDS. And we need to take it on with every measure of seriousness because it poses a threat to Israel's fundamental legitimacy. That is, to Israel's very right to exist as a manifestation of the Jewish people, all of us, yearning to live freely. We need to expose and combat the extremists and anti-Semites who are behind this noxious idea. BDS is indeed an idea that flies in the face of the basic principles that animate this institution. It's an idea which pushes out the very solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is a mutual peace, that the world has sought in that region since 1948 when the Palestinian leadership rejected a mutual arrangement that could have ended the conflict before it began. And we also need to educate and seriously engage those who would join this movement, even if they don't share the BDS leaders' campaign of making Israel disappear from the map. Let me be clear. At its core, BDS is an anti-Semitic movement. It is part and parcel of that larger effort to delegitimize the Jewish state. That is, to erode its basic foundational legitimacy. Don't believe anyone who tells you otherwise. I see these movements as a CEO of the ADL through the lens of the long history of anti-Semitism in the world. At the core of the most virulent manifestations of anti-Semitism for 2 millennia was a terrible fantasy about the Jewish people, that we were all powerful and evil. A fantasy, of course, because it bore no resemblance or reality to the relationship of the Jewish people and their powerlessness in countries all over the world. For millennia, we were without a home of our own. Jews were defenseless, largely oppressed and discriminated against. We didn't live as equals in the countries where we had homes. I think of my own children today, whose paternal lineage they trace through Eastern Europe, or whose maternal lineage they trace back through Iran. If my children look back, they will see that their direct ancestors and their other Jewish compatriots were marginalized, ostracized, and tolerated in the Christian and Muslim societies they called home, until push came to shove, and then they were forcibly converted, physically removed, or irrationally murdered. This fact pattern of continuous victimization, unfortunately, is tragically irrefutable. Of course, it hasn't stopped the anti-Semites from concocting conspiracies of Jewish global world domination. It hasn't diluted the racism at the core of the delegitimization movement. However, since the Holocaust, the culmination of that lethal combination of Jew hatred and Jewish powerlessness, the Jewish people have acquired a degree of power that gives us strength, even in the face of hatred. This power is represented right here. You see that signet on the podium? By the State of Israel. That power is represented right here in the democratic processes in countries like the United States of America, and in the form of the support for Israel that remains core to the American Jewish community and our allies in the U.S. and other countries. Thank God for this welcome change in the history of the Jewish people. But this also meant that there is now room for legitimate criticism of Israel as a country. Let me be clear, no state is beyond reproach, and no leadership of any political entity is free from the responsibilities to the governed or for the consequences of their policies. But that being said, BDS and the delegitimization of Israel have nothing, and I repeat, nothing, to do with a legitimate criticism of Israel and her policies. Its aims are way out of proportion to the discourse of legitimate criticism. Despite the claims of the BDS crowd about taboos that inhibit their criticism of Israel, is there any state in the world that is more widely criticized than Israel? Despite the protests of the pundits who express their indignation that they supposedly cannot critique Israel, is there any nation in the world that attracts more self-righteous indignation than the Jewish state of Israel? So let's see BDS for what it is. A continuation, a modern expression, if you will, of an irrational hatred of the Jewish people. Boycotting Israeli businesses today is no different than boycotting my grandfather's barber shop in pre-war Germany. Denying the rights of Jewish academics to express their views here in the U.S., that's no different than denying the ability of Jewish academics to teach freely in my wife's home country of Iran. In truth, despite the veneer of rationality attached to BDS and delegitimization, as I am saying, these tactics aren't new. They are a continuation of what seems like an eternal campaign against the Jewish people. Simply blaming Israel for the absence of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, not to mention the Arab world, is deeply unhinged and divorced from reality of almost 7 decades of an ongoing effort to destroy the Jewish state. It completely ignores the context out of which Israel's policies emerge and creates a narrative of the Jewish state as the archetypal villain in every event, in which every false charge, every alleged crime, however fantastical, the allegation confirms their assumption that Israel's fundamental sin is, well, the fact that it exists. Denying only Israel the right to exist and to express Jewish sovereignty and Jewish self-determination in its historic home, when all other peoples either are granted that right de jure or at least their rights are acknowledged de facto, that, my friends, is classic anti-Semitism. And take that from the CEO of the ADL. Now, it's important to distinguish here that since the outset of the peace process in the early 90s under Peres and Rabin, Israel has engaged in negotiations whose ultimate outcome would be the emergence of a Palestinian state, which would be the embodiment of what the Palestinians profess to want. Supporting that goal is not the same thing as denying the Jewish right to self-determination. But denying the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel lies at the heart of the BDS movement. This anti-Semitic fantasy justifies Palestinian rejectionism, despite the stubborn fact of our 2,000 years of history that have kept the Jewish people alive and united despite being a diaspora. And in a region where democracy is non-existent outside Israel, a region engulfed in the most brutal forms of sectarian strife and civil war, a region where Israel stands out as exemplary in comparison to every one of its neighbors in terms of its treatment of ethnic and religious and gender minorities, to see Israel alone castigated for human rights violations or for the conduct of its military. These are grotesque distortions of reality that can only be attributed to anti-Semitism, or if you prefer, an irrational, obsessive hatred of the Jewish people. So let's be open and honest about it. The founders and organizers of BDS, like Omar Barghouti and the Students for Justice in Palestine, they're not dedicated to a vision which many of us in this room, in the world community, share. They don't share a vision of 2 states living in peace, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state that has been confirmed again and again and again by the international community as the only reasonable means to reconcile the situation in the region? No. Their campaigns are geared instead toward the sinister purpose of making Israel a pariah state, to set it up for destruction and disappearance from the world. They share this goal with many, shall we say, less polite company, whose anti-Semitism is bare for all to see. As always, though, regarding extremists and anti-Semites, we must expose and thus delegitimize the delegitimizers. We must condemn them unequivocally and engage government, university, religious, and corporate leaders to denounce them as well. In other words, we need a full-scale plan of attack to expose the haters and differentiate them from others who do indeed seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. That's necessary, and it won't be easy. What makes the struggle much more complex, particularly on our campuses? How many of you in this audience are students or have children on college campuses or grandchildren? Raise your hands. So many of us. So I can tell you what we see at the ADL as making this struggle much more complex is a significant strengthening of the hardcore extremists by large numbers of people. Let's call them joiners. People who may not be motivated by anti-Semitism or a desire to see Israel disappear altogether. Based on a joint analysis by ADL and the Roth Institute in Israel, we have found that these joiners compose the vast majority of those who lend credence to the campaigns. This presents a major challenge for all of us in this room, because these are individuals, as misguided as they may be, who have been influenced by anti-Israel propaganda, or who may be susceptible to this perspective because they are frustrated by the continuing conflict. They've bought into a narrative and are looking to act, so they mistakenly believe that BDS presents them an opportunity because of an absence of other credible alternatives. But even if this, if we can call it long tail of followers, are not motivated by anti-Semitism, their support of the anti-Israel BDS movement makes its inherent anti-Semitism much more acceptable. And if anti-Semitism has been inhibited in the post-Holocaust world by the shame of Auschwitz, this assault today on Israel's good name erodes that sense of shame. It provides a platform for the worst images, the most hideous theories, the most terrible anti-Semitic ideas today, paving the way for physical violence against Jewish communities around the world. And this isn't imagined. Jewish communities are indeed under threat in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and even here at home. At the ADL, we track anti-Semitic incidents and attitudes, and we see a marked increase in such activities after anti-Israel votes on campus. Folks, it's not a correlation, it's a causation. But one cannot approach this long tail of the BDS movement, this large group of supporters who have some sympathy for BDS, in the same way we deal with the hardcore extremists. Calling these people anti-Semites will only close off any possibility of engaging and understanding them. Only by engaging them, only by creating viable alternatives for those who seek a two-state solution that respects Israel's right to self-determination, can we peel away the long tail from this destructive movement of BDS. This is a role that I think we can uniquely play at ADL. For more than 100 years, we've used a variety of means, including legal and legislative strategies, education programming and community engagement, public relations and private outreach to protect the Jewish people. We've attempted to embody the ancient counsel of Hillel and the modern words of Niemöller by fighting for others because this builds allies to support us in the fight for ourselves. It's not quid pro quo, but work that must be done authentically, gradually, and intensely, because only by building relationships and crafting coalitions can we stand together. And make no mistake, we in the Jewish community are small. We are few in number. We are stronger when we stand with our allies. Remember the declaration made in these chambers to recognize the Jewish state of Israel. It didn't happen because of angry op-eds or press releases. It happened not because of volleys of social media. It happened because the Zionist movement made its case in capitals and coffee shops around the world to Jews and non-Jews. It happened because our forebears labored in public and engaged with allies in private. It happened because there was a literal coalition of nations who endorsed Jewish sovereignty. So I am proud to stand on the shoulders of those giants and remain committed to building alliances and strengthening our case on college campuses and corporate boardrooms, cultural venues, wherever the racists of delegitimization lurk. And we need to reach out to those people who've been mesmerized, seduced by that oversimplified rhetoric despite its hidden agenda. We must make it clear to them what BDS is about. We must insist that if their goal is to make the situation in the region better, they should focus on working on the ground to build prosperity in civil society rather than trying to tear down the enduring and resilient Jewish state. Those who have dedicated themselves to the cause of Palestinian independence should be building incentives for Palestinians to make the necessary compromises. Imagine if rather than boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, The BDS forces focus on businesses, investments, and startups to support a Palestinian economy. Looking ahead, and I'm about to close, there's no silver bullet that will stop delegitimization. We should rid ourselves of such magic realism. It will require a variety of means. Different groups will attempt different tactics. Some will work, some will fail. But if we avoid criticizing one another and instead soberly and smartly attempt experiments, iterate based on results, then we can scale what works, and we likely will achieve better, more durable outcomes. And that's, my background is not as an activist in the Jewish community. It's as an entrepreneur and a corporate executive. That's how it works in the private sector. That's how we should make it work here. Attempt pilots, see what works, and then scale what's successful. So unlike some leaders, I will not slam or slander those within our community with whom I might disagree, but who get the basics right, particularly support for a strong and secure democratic and Jewish state of Israel, and support for a two-state solution that guarantees Israel and its people peace and security. Is that a litmus test? You bet it is. And I have no shame in setting it out in these explicit terms. But shame on those leaders who lack the seichel and prefer to attack each other than focus on our real enemies and the real problems at hand. Whether or not we at ADL will adopt every approach, I applaud those groups who use the law and legislation to fight delegitimization, like those that you're going to hear from on the panel in a moment. I celebrate individuals that opt for education and programming to beat back BDS. We should honor those who use naming and shaming to expose the enemies of peace. And I approve of efforts to prepare our students more effectively for the challenges on campus, as well as those who insist that university presidents and administrators use their influence, not to bar the speech of the activists, but to articulate in the clearest terms how evil and counterproductive BDS really is to the cause of peace. Let me conclude with a story. Back in 2001, when a divestment initiative came to Harvard, then President Larry Summers spoke out. He said that any comparison of democratic Israel to apartheid South Africa was morally abhorrent, factually inaccurate, and divestment at Harvard would never happen under his watch. That, my friends, was leadership. The divestment campaign at Harvard soon died. We need more moral courage of this order among our leaders in every segment of society. As I said earlier, boycotting the Jewish people is not exactly a novel idea. We've seen this movie before, even if the current specter of delegitimization offers special challenges. But remember, we defeated the Arab boycott of Israel. We repealed the infamous UN resolution equating Zionism and racism. And let's keep in mind our assets, particularly the justice of our cause, the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our historic home, the power we have when we are united, and the wide array of options that the State of Israel and its allies possess to fundamentally alter the playing field. In closing, at ADL, we will use a mix of models, a variety of strategies, including social entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation in order to defeat delegitimization. Because we must win this struggle, and we will win the struggle because we are in the right, and history has taught us that we cannot afford to lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Greenblatt, for all your work and this powerful statement. Ladies and gentlemen, now on to our panel of experts. I would like to introduce our moderator, Stuart Roth, Senior Counsel to the American Center for Law and Justice, and our panelists, who after this will take the panel. Ann Herzberg, Legal Advisor at NGO Monitor, Gabe Groisman, Councilman to Bell Harbor Village Council, Carly Gammill, the Senior Litigation Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Elizabeth Liz Berney, Director of Special Projects at the Zionist Organization of America, and Dr. Mark Goldfeder, Senior Lecturer at Emory Law School. Please take the panel, and Stuart, the floor is yours.
this mic? Everybody can hear me? Yeah. All right, we've got a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time, so this may be like a lightning round. But Carly, I'm going to start with you. With the rise of all this pro-BDS activities on campus, the ACLJ has successfully represented both students and faculty members. Tell us what the applicable laws are, which students should be aware of, and some of the legal issues that they face.
I think this is a crucial question, and for this reason. We have to be creative in our strategies, and we have to be aggressive in implementing those strategies. In order to do that, students and other members of the community who are fighting this have to be aware of some of these issues and what's available to them, and also some of the pitfalls. If we're talking about on campus, you have to be aware of the policies, the governing rules on campus in the first place. If you don't know what those rules are, you don't know whether they're being violated. So that's a front-end action, kind of a research project. But if you're on campus and you're going to be engaged in this fight, you have to know what the policies are, the applicable policies, whether we're talking about discrimination policies, things like the governing documents. I mean, these are things that have been instrumental in the cases that we've handled, governing documents of student government associations, because some BDS resolutions that have been proposed have actually run afoul of the governing documents of that body. And so it takes that kind of initiative and understanding to be able to identify and say, hey, no, you can't do this. And then obviously, the grassroots work of getting the coalition of folks together to fight that. Also, the issues of recording laws. I mean, this may not seem like something that you would naturally think of, but it's actually been instrumental in some of the situations that we've handled, being aware of the recording laws in the jurisdiction that you're in. Is it a one-party state? Is it a two-party state? Can I record an event that's happening? Can I record a conversation maybe that's taking place? These are some things that have actually been really instrumental. You also don't want to be on the wrong side of that. If there's a conversation that's taking place that you want to have a record of, being aware of those types of things. And I don't want to get too nuanced, and I have to say that Justice Rubinstein's comment about the fact that this is a nuanced area, and so there's not any easy answer to this, but understanding the difference in terms of free speech, First Amendment type issues, what is protected and what isn't protected. Not that students and community members necessarily are expected to understand all those nuances, but just to be aware that just because speech is taking place, it may be protected, it may not be, but being aware mentally, of asking that question of yourself, might this be a problem?
Well, I want to turn to Mark for this question. Mark, recently at UC Irvine, students associated with the group Students for Justice to Palestine, they basically crashed a movie that was held about the IDF. There was profanities, there was blocking of doors, there was all sorts of conduct. When does speech cross the line from protected free speech to unprotected free speech that is actually legally actionable?
Here's the bottom line, and I want to really address the students in the room to make sure that they have it pretty clear. First of all, in both public and private institutions, it's important to note that the freedom of speech and even offensive speech should be cherished and respected, because that's part of what makes our democracy so great. But not all speech is protected. And the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights has made it very clear that there are times when speech crosses over into harassment and invidious discrimination. So let's get specific, okay? The standard comes from a case called Davis versus Monroe, and it's pretty simple. Harassment can take many forms. It can be verbal, it can be written, but whatever form it takes, if it is severe, persistent, or pervasive enough to limit or deny a student's ability to participate in or benefit from an educational program, that speech is not protected. And unfortunately, over the last few years, we've seen that happen from coast to coast, from the UC system to the CUNY system, but it won't happen anymore because we're not going to let it. Just last month, after BDS... tell you a very quick story. Just last month, after a BDS resolution passed at CUNY, several of the people on this panel, including Carly and Stuart at the ACLJ, in conjunction with other organizations, including Stand With Us and the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, we sent a letter to the university, and we reminded them of their responsibilities under the law. They have a responsibility to make sure their campus is a safe, non-harassing, non-discriminatory environment for students and employees, and guess what? 6 days later, the chancellor himself wrote back, and he said that he's putting together a task force and is going to recommend some of the various suggestions in our letter. But that's not the only strategy we're using. Academics do have a lot of freedom to talk about their views, but they can't single out one group and make them feel uncomfortable. Universities and academic organizations can make all kinds of statements, but they have to be in keeping with their own missions and their charters. So, for instance, in 2013, many of you know, the American Studies Association, an academic association for the study of American culture, suddenly decided that they were going to enter into politics full steam ahead, and they voted to boycott Israel. And so last month, the Brandeis Center led the charge to sue them in D.C. for violating their own charter and violating the D.C. law governing nonprofit organizations. And so the basic message for the students and other people here today is that bottom line, whether it's local, state, or federal law, whether it's a public or a private university, we have this, and we're going to win.
I want to direct this question to Elizabeth. Two of the primary myths and lies advanced by the BDS movement is that Israel is in violation of international law by illegally occupying the Palestinian people and committing war crimes on Gaza. Could you share with our audience and our college students why that is not true, so when they go back to their college campuses and when they go back to their homes, they're well equipped and they can understand how to counter all of these arguments?
You're absolutely right that the myths of occupation and war crimes are the key myths that are used by the BDS organizers. This is just a denial of Jewish history, and a lot of that history has to do with the UN, and also it perverts a lot of UN resolutions. For instance, we often hear that Israel is violating rights of refugees. You always hear the statements about UN Resolution 181, 181, and 194. These resolutions are supposed to deal with a resolution of the refugees of both parties, namely the close to 1 million Jews who had to flee from Arab nations in 1948 through 1951, as well as Palestinians Arabs who actually left on their own at the instigation of the Arab High Command. Many people seem to forget that the Arab High Command and the leaders of the Arab nations asked the Arabs, please leave because we're going to be invading Israel. Get out of the way. That's one of the prime. However, we always hear about Resolution 181, 1 and 194. Another thing that we often hear about is the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention. The BDS groups often falsely claim that just the presence of Israeli Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria is an illegal war crime under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. That is also not true. The Geneva Convention was the Geneva Convention was designed to prevent a recurrence of what the Nazis did, forcible transfers of Jews to extermination and forced labor camps. It speaks about forcible transfers. Israelis who moved to Judea and Samaria were not transferred there forcibly. They went there willingly to be on land that was Jewish land for the millennia.
And Elizabeth, I've got to move on because we're running short on time.
These are two of the main.
I want to turn to Gabe because as a member of the Village Council of Bal Harbour, they passed the first anti-BDS ordinance in the country. And Gabe, you've got a fascinating little story surrounding that. Can you quickly share it with our audience?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So in last summer, we learned that at the end of June of 2015, the United Church of Christ, which is one of the largest Protestant churches in this country with over 1 million members, passed a resolution boycotting and divesting from Israel. At the same time, a few of the states started passing some anti-BDS resolutions. So I reached out to Israel Allies Foundation, who was behind some of those early resolutions, and together we crafted this anti-BDS resolution. And the reason why was because in our community there is a United Church of Christ church called the Church by the Sea, who I knew around the corner was going to try to redevelop. To redevelop, you need to enter into a development agreement with the city, and our law requires any agreement with our municipality to include a representation that the contracting party is not involved in and will not be involved in the boycott or divestment of any authorized trading partner of the United States, including Israel. So just 3 months ago, the church applied for a development agreement to redevelop their church, as I had predicted, and I deferred the item, giving them an opportunity to sit down with me to discuss this issue. I had a surreal meeting with the reverend of the church, a member of the board, and their attorneys. We had about a 3.5-hour meeting where we had the opportunity to discuss the history of BDS and to put plainly to them that whether they know it or not, their church is now part and parcel of the world's largest anti-Semitic movement since the 1940s. And that now it's up to them as an individual church to decide if they're going to continue to be a part of that or they're going to separate themselves both in word and in deed. So what I was able to get from them was a letter which I brought here with me today, which was published. It's a public letter from them repudiating and rejecting their own church's boycott and divestment from Israel. And putting their money where their mouths are, they withdrew over $2.9 million of their investment in the church's investment fund. So the church has its own, the church has an investment arm that invests in accordance with the church's principles. So I was able to get them to withdraw every dollar from that fund and do so publicly, and now, therefore, they're in turn going to be allowed to move forward with their development.
I wish we had a lot of time to go. So many success stories. We are going to be victors in this battle, not victims. I want to address this to Ann. Where does the BDS movement get its financing, and what are their financial and political ties to known terrorist organizations?
So I think one of the main aspects we've heard about BDS is that it's anti-Semitic and discriminatory, but one aspect that people are probably not aware of is that the BDS movement is getting most of its funding from European governments, from taxpayer money, and also from European churches, as well as the Quakers in the United States. And so it's very important, and that's what our organization has been doing, has been tracking this funding, constantly bringing examples to the governments, to officials, to expose what their money is being used for, overt instances of anti-Semitism and BDS campaigns. And in the United States, there has to be a lot more work done on groups like the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which is now funding the Jewish Voice for Peace, and a lot of additional BDS organizations. They seem to have taken up, some of the funding had been cut off elsewhere, and the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation now appears to be picking up that funding. So that's one organization that people should be focusing their efforts on. And I don't want to say, though, it's all bad news, because if you look especially in Europe, where a lot of this money is coming from, there are at least 5 countries now that are reevaluating their funding for these BDS organizations. Switzerland, there was a lot of news reports about it last week, how they're taking up an inquiry about it. And just today in the Jerusalem Post, there was an article how PayPal has cut off funding for BDS groups in France. You have Germany, Austria, and Italy have also cut off banking to BDS organizations due to their potential links to terror groups, which some of them have, as well as for the fact that they are discriminatory, engaging in discrimination, national origin, and religious discrimination. And you also have governments in Spain and the UK banning boycott movements. And of course, in the United States, we now have, I think, at least 30 states that have adopted anti-BDS legislation, and that's had great impact. For instance, there was a bank in Denmark that had listed an Israeli company for boycott, and Illinois put it on its list of companies that they would not be able to do government contracts with, and as a result of that, that Israeli company was taken off the blacklist by the Danish bank. So these are great developments, and we should continue to push for them and follow the money, follow the money.
All right, I'd like to give all of our participants about a minute or so to make some closing statements or closing thoughts. Carly?
I think if I have 1 minute, what I think is most important for everyone to understand is the crucial nature of being aggressive and proactive in this. We've seen time and time again that the proponents of BDS are very aggressive, they're very proactive, and there are opportunities and there are ways for us now to be aggressive, to take back the territory. We talk about counter speech. We talk about knowing the facts, not being drawn into the narrative, but actually speaking the narrative of truth. Some of the things that Liz has talked about. So I think that this is no longer a time to be able to sit back and just wait and see what happens. It's happening. If it hasn't come to your campus yet or to your community yet, sitting back and just crossing your fingers and hoping it's not going to happen, I think is a fool's errand. And instead, what we need to be doing is being creative, taking advantage of, you heard Dr. Sekulow talk earlier about some of the ways that we've been able to take advantage of the laws that already are on the books, whether it be public accommodation laws, taking advantage of policies at various campuses, taking advantage of the opportunity that we have to draft model legislation. All of these things are ways that we are being proactive, and I think it's crucial now that we all start thinking in those terms in order to, as we've said, it's a must-win situation, and I think that that's crucial in how we do that.
That are available. The Zionist organization actually fought a 6-year battle to have the Office of Civil Rights include Jewish students among the groups that are protected from harassment. And it's a very important, these are very important tools, because if a university violates these harassment requirements, they can lose federal funding. So it's been a very important tool. The Zionist Organization of America has used that to get the first step is usually to deal with the administration, but if that doesn't work, they have hanging over their head the tool of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, extremely important. We've used that, for instance, at Brooklyn College to get changes in policies and an apology to Jewish students who were ousted from a BDS event. Extremely important. The range also includes civil remedies. New York State, for instance, has a human rights law that outlaws discriminatory boycotts. Federal criminal remedies, regular civil remedies such as defamation suits. Ariel University, for instance, brought an anti-boycott case in the Spanish courts because its architecture students had reached the global finals for the world's most environmentally friendly home, and then were excluded because Ariel University is located in Judea and Samaria. So never lose heart that there are many ways that we have many aspects available, and also we are here for you. The Zionist Organization of America has been dealing with this for the past 12 years. We have in-house lawyers. We're working with other groups, many of the other groups that are on the panel here. College students should not be afraid to contact us. Contact COA, contact NBDS.com, contact all of us. We're here for you, to help you. Also, if there are the many rights that you have, for instance, to have attorney, to have representation if a Jewish student gets in trouble and is unfairly targeted by an administration. And please come to us, and also remember there is no occupation. Thank you.
In 2014, Omar Barghouti, one of the leaders of the BDS movement, who, by the way, for all his talk, was educated at Tel Aviv University, one of the universities that he boycotts. In 2014, he issued the following challenge. He said, either smarter people have abandoned Zionism, or the average IQ of Zionists has gone down because they haven't come up with one smart tactic to fight BDS. We're not being cocky about that. I mean, seriously, we're not facing any challenges here. I'll let you decide if he's being cocky about that. And challenging Jews in lawfare it's kind of our national sport. But on behalf of the panel, challenge accepted. I was a rabbi before I became a lawyer, so indulge me for 1 minute if I tell you that the proper response to this BDS war is a paraphrasing from the book of Joshua 1:9. Joshua's about to go wage war on behalf of Israel, and of course it is a serious matter, but God says to him, Yeshua, relax. Be strong and courageous. Have I not commanded you? Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Look at this panel. Does Carly look afraid? Does Liz look afraid? Does Stuart look afraid? No, because they're not. And you should not be afraid either. You heard this morning from ACLJ's chief counsel, Jay Sekulow. He's won so many Supreme Court cases, it's not even fun anymore. He's on your team. And there are so many other people who are here that you haven't heard from. Political lobbyist Jeff Balaban. If you Google Chuck Norris of International Relations, literally his name comes up. He's here. He's on your team. There are hundreds and thousands of people on your team. You're not afraid. Don't be afraid because you're not alone. Now, if you go to endbds.com, remember one name, endbds.com. It's a collaborative effort on behalf of a variety of organizations. It has educational aspects. It has a Know Your Rights pamphlet. Most importantly, it has a 24/7 hotline. If you have a problem, you can call us or send us an email. It goes to the ACLJ, the Brandeis Center. It goes to the International Legal Forum, the Lawfare Project, Stand With Us, and the ZOA. If you need us, we will be there to help you. You're not alone. Don't be afraid.
I'll put in a plug also for our organization. It's NGO Monitor, www.ngo-monitor.org. And on our website, we have dozens of files on all the organizations involved in BDS, their funding sources. You can search by organization. You can search by funder. In addition to that, we have dozens of resources on BDS, on the legal arguments. We do a lot of work at the UN. Our organization is accredited at the UN. And we go to the Human Rights Council sessions. We do a lot of letter writing campaigns and activities there. And you can find all of that information on our website. One of the things that the BDS movement does is traffics in distortions, omissions, and outright falsehoods. And we have a lot of the information, especially for the students, to combat that, because it can feel a little overwhelming when you have someone spouting off a dozen Security Council resolutions to you or legal terms that you may not understand, when if you actually did a little bit of digging behind it, you would find that they are misusing and misrepresenting those terms. So you can come to our website and take a look at that. You can certainly contact us. We're always happy to help. If you're on campus and you need help with writing op-eds or other types of activity, definitely get in touch with us. So thanks.
So you've heard quickly the story or my story in Bal Harbour, Florida. I implore you all to learn about all the laws that have passed in the states and cities across this country. The purpose of these laws are to put a price tag on the decision of joining the BDS movement. We all now have ammunition to fight this war against BDS, but do not assume that someone else is going to use these laws. Do not assume that someone else is going to be out there fighting this for us. They're not. We need each and every one of you and all your friends and all of your communities to be doing this. Press your lawmakers. Use the courts. The laws are powerful tools, but they're only valuable if we use them. Support Israel at every turn. Remember to be proud Jews, to be proud Zionists, and if we all do this, we will defeat BDS. Am Yisrael Chai.
And one last thought. Never again means simply that. Never again. It is not a slogan. It's a commitment. It's a commitment that we have to each other to stand up and protect. I realize during this crazy political season, we have lots of differences between us. But on this one issue, BDS and anti-Semitism, there can be no space or daylight between us. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our panelists and our moderator for a great discussion. Folks, I'd like to remind everyone that closing session of this conference will take place in conference room 3 and will be live broadcast in this room. So if you want to stay here, you can see this on these screens. There will be coffee and light refreshments right outside. Thanks again, and thank you for coming.